She lay weak by the broken trail. A cowboy lifted her into the saddle and changed both lives. The sun hung heavy over the endless expanse of land. It was the kind of heat that pressed down on your shoulders and made the world feel smaller, isolated, quiet, and distant. Dust rose in slow, lazy swirls from the cracked earth, and the only sound for miles was the gentle whine of the wind pushing across the empty plains. Jenna hadn't meant for things to go this way. She had set out with purpose, her backpack packed with supplies, a map marked with the route she intended to take, and a resolve she thought could withstand anything. But no plan ever survives the trail, and it didn't take long before everything started to crumble. It had been 5 days since she lost her way. The trail she had followed for miles had turned into a series of narrow paths that seemed to end at random. The further she walked, the more the desert stretched around her, empty and unforgiving. Her water had run low 2 days ago, and what little food she had left wasn't enough to keep her going. She tried to find shelter, tried to search for signs of civilization, but the land was indifferent, silent, and unhelpful. Now there she was, lying in the dirt, barely able to lift her head. Her body was weak from hunger, and every breath felt like it came from somewhere deep, as though the air had become thick with exhaustion. Her feet ached from walking without rest, her clothes sticky from sweat, and the sunburns on her arms and face were a constant reminder of how badly she had miscalculated. Her mind was foggy, drifting between sleep and wakefulness. She knew she had to keep moving, but the thought of standing up was unbearable. The world around her seemed to spin, and she couldn't quite figure out if she was imagining the figure on horseback that appeared on the horizon, or if it was really there. Jenna blinked hard and rubbed her eyes. The figure was real, a cowboy. He was riding a large brown horse, his silhouette outlined against the bright blue sky. He appeared out of nowhere, as though he had materialized from the land itself, a part of the wilderness. She tried to raise her hand in greeting but couldn't find the strength. As the cowboy drew closer, Jenna's heart thudded in her chest. She had heard stories about people who had wandered too far into the wilderness and been lost forever. But there was something about this cowboy, something that didn't feel threatening. His approach was slow, steady. He wasn't in a hurry. He stopped his horse a few feet away from her. His boots, covered in dust, hit the ground with a soft thud. Jenna's vision swam and she closed her eyes again, too tired to care. Maybe he was a mirage. Maybe he was the last flicker of hope before everything went dark. She didn't know, but she felt too weak to fight it. The cowboy dismounted with ease, his movements smooth and practiced. He crouched beside her, a shadow blocking out the harsh sun. Jenna could barely make out his face, but she saw enough to notice the weathered lines around his eyes, the hint of salt and pepper in his dark hair, and the strength that came with a life spent outdoors. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deep but not rough. There was no judgment in it, only a quiet curiosity, as though he were trying to decide whether or not she was real. Jenna opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her throat was dry, cracked, and aching. She tried to focus on his face, but her vision blurred. "Water," she whispered, her voice little more than a rasp. The cowboy nodded without hesitation. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a canteen. He unscrewed the lid, careful not to spill any of the precious liquid. Slowly he brought it to her lips. Jenna took a sip, feeling the cool water slide down her parched throat. It was like a miracle, the relief flooding through her in waves. He didn't rush her. He let her drink slowly, allowing her time to recover bit by bit. For a few moments, Jenna simply closed her eyes, savoring the feeling of the water. When she finally pulled away, she felt a little stronger, though the weakness still clung to her body like an old friend. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice hoarse. The cowboy didn't answer at first. He only studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly as he looked over her as if he were sizing her up. "What happened to you?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. "Where are you trying to go?" "But everything's changed out here. The maps, they don't help." He knew that the desert could be both beautiful and brutal, that it could change in an instant, and that even the most experienced traveler could be lost if they weren't paying attention. "You're not the first to get turned around out here," he said, his voice softer now. "The desert has a way of swallowing you up if you're not careful." "Stay with me for a minute," he said, "just rest." As she lay there, Jenna could feel the cowboy's gaze lingering on her, not in a hurry, not pushing her to respond. He was studying her, not just her appearance, but the way her body seemed to tremble with every breath, the way her face was drawn with exhaustion. There was no rush in him. He had no expectations. He had simply stopped because something inside him had urged him to. He could have kept riding, could have ignored the fragile figure on the side of the trail, but something had pulled him in. Maybe it was the way she looked so small, so lost, or maybe it was the quiet defiance in her that said she wasn't ready to give up, even though the world around her had almost done it for her. He didn't know what it was, but he felt it, and somehow he couldn't turn away. The cowboy had never been one to second-guess himself. In his world, there was little room for hesitation. He had learned early on that when you made a decision, whether it was about the cattle, the land, or the long stretches of quiet roads that seemed to lead nowhere, you had to stick with it. There was no time for uncertainty, no time for slowing down. That was the way it had always been until he found her. At first, it had seemed like a simple decision. He was on his way to check on a neighboring ranch, his horse carrying him over the dusty trail. The day had been long, the heat unforgiving, and the promise of a hot meal and a place to rest at the end of it was enough to keep him going. His mind had been focused on the task ahead, nothing more, nothing less. But then just as he crested a small hill, he saw her. He had passed many travelers over the years, ranch hands, traders, sometimes even families out in the middle of nowhere. But this time was different. This time, something in the back of his mind nudged him, making him pull his horse to a stop without thinking. He had learned to trust his instincts, even when they didn't make sense. They had kept him safe, kept him grounded through countless years on the open range. So when he saw her lying in the dirt beside the broken trail, the instinct that urged him to dismount and approach was stronger than the one telling him to keep going. It didn't make sense. He was on a schedule. He had places to be, work to do. Stopping could waste hours he didn't have. But the thought of continuing on without even checking, without knowing who or what this person was, felt wrong. He looked down at her now, still lying weakly beside the trail. He could see the dirt clinging to her clothes, the faded colors of her backpack, the dried blood on her scraped knees. But what struck him most was how small she seemed, her body barely visible beneath the layers of sunburned skin and dust. Her face was bruised, pale, and tired, but there was something in the way she held herself that told him she had been fighting for a long time. The cowboy kneeled beside her carefully, adjusting his hat so that the sun didn't blind him. He had seen enough pain in his life to recognize it quickly. It wasn't just physical, it was deeper than that. A kind of quiet struggle that went unnoticed, like the land around them, stretching for miles without any sense of comfort. He couldn't leave her. He just couldn't. His mind tried to talk him out of it, told him that he had more important things to do, that she was probably just another wanderer who had taken a wrong turn and wouldn't be worth the trouble. But in that moment, the cowboy made a decision. The choice wasn't rational. It wasn't calculated. It was just something that felt right. He slid off his horse, the dust crunching beneath his boots as he moved closer to her. He could hear the faint rasp of her breath, each one coming slower than the last. There wasn't much time, he realized. She was hanging on by a thread. The cowboy didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He didn't even need to know who she was. He just needed to help her. "Water," she whispered, barely audible when he leaned over her. He didn't hesitate. Reaching into his saddlebag, he pulled out his canteen and gently held it to her lips. She drank in small, weak sips, and with each one he could feel a little more life return to her. It wasn't much, just enough to give her a brief moment of relief. But it was something, and sometimes that was enough. The silence between them was heavy. She didn't speak, and he didn't push her to. There were no questions yet, no demands. only the sound of the wind rustling the dried grass and the steady rhythm of their breathing. When she finally pulled away from the canteen, her eyes fluttered open. They were tired, unfocused, but there was something in them, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or just a simple understanding that someone had stopped to help. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but the gratitude in her tone was unmistakable. The cowboy gave her a small nod. "You're welcome. Can you sit up?" he asked gently, watching her carefully. Jenna nodded slightly, but it was clear she didn't have the strength to do much more than shift her position. Her body sagged under the effort and her breath hitched. It took everything in her just to raise her head, and even that seemed like too much. The cowboy wasn't sure what to do next. He didn't know her story, didn't know where she had come from or where she was trying to go. He could guess from her disheveled appearance and the way she had collapsed that she had been traveling alone for a long time, but beyond that, he couldn't make assumptions. He knelt beside her again, his voice low. "We need to get you somewhere safe. Can you hold on for a bit longer?" The thought of moving, of riding out with him, seemed impossible, but she had no choice. She had to. The cowboy wasn't a man of many words, but there was something in his presence that made her feel a little safer, a little less alone. His calm manner was grounding, and though she didn't know him, she instinctively trusted him. She didn't have the energy to think much beyond that, but it was enough to make her want to hold on. He glanced at his horse, his brow furrowing as he considered the next step. His horse was strong, sure-footed, but it was a long way back to the nearest ranch. He knew that if he didn't get her moving soon, the desert would claim her as it had claimed so many others before. The sun was already low in the sky, and soon the coolness of the evening would settle in, making the journey even harder. Without hesitation, he made his decision. He had to get her back on her feet, or at least onto his horse. He would figure the rest out later. He moved quickly but gently. His hands were steady as he helped her to her feet. She flinched at the pressure on her legs, but she didn't protest. Her body was weak, but there was still a fire in her, an ember that hadn't been extinguished yet. Once she was standing, he reached for the reins of his horse and guided it closer to her. "Here," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'll help you onto the saddle." It was a long way up, and the idea of climbing onto the horse seemed impossible, but somehow she trusted him. She trusted him enough to let him help her, enough to follow his lead. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Okay." Once they were both up, he adjusted his position, keeping a steady hand on the reins. "We're going to take it slow," he said, his voice calm, almost reassuring. "Just hold on to me." The warmth of the cowboy beside her, the steady thud of hooves, and the wide-open sky above her made her feel something she hadn't felt in days: hope. The cowboy didn't say much more. There was no need for words. He had made his choice, and for now, that was enough. They rode in silence, the trail winding through the endless desert, the land sprawling out before them in its quiet majesty. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the earth, and the heat that had once been suffocating now started to lose its grip. For the first time in a long while, Jenna let herself relax, her head resting against the cowboy's back. She could feel his warmth, his strength, and something else, a quiet kind of determination. It was strange, but it was enough. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She didn't know where this road would lead. But for now, for this moment, it felt like she had a chance. The journey back to the cowboy's ranch was long, but it wasn't as difficult as Jenna had feared. The rhythm of the horse's steady gait, combined with the steady presence of the cowboy beside her, made her feel safer than she had in days. The landscape seemed endless, and yet there was a calmness to the desert at this hour that she had never experienced before. The sun was low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over everything, making the land appear almost peaceful. But the cowboy had warned her that the desert could be kind and cruel, often in the same breath. As they rode, Jenna's mind began to clear, though her body still felt heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't realized just how much of herself she had been fighting to keep alive. The journey, the fear, the loneliness, it had all taken its toll. But now, with the wind at her back and the cowboy's steady presence beside her, it felt like a small part of her was finally able to let go. She was conscious of how the cowboy kept a close eye on her, his gaze occasionally flicking to her face to make sure she was holding up. He didn't talk much, and Jenna was grateful for that. His silence was comforting. He wasn't trying to push her into conversation or make her explain things she wasn't ready to talk about. Instead, he seemed content to let the land speak for itself, as if the long stretches of desert could somehow offer more than any words could. As they moved farther from the trail where he had found her, the landscape began to change. The flat, dry plains slowly gave way to rolling hills and pockets of green. The ground wasn't as cracked here, and a few scrubby trees dotted the horizon. The cowboy guided his horse with ease, his experience in the wilderness evident in every movement. Jenna tried to focus on the beauty of the land, but her mind kept wandering back to the events that had led her here. She hadn't been sure of where she was going when she had started this journey. She had simply needed to get away. To get away from the memories that haunted her every step, the pain of losing everything she had once believed in. Her heart had been broken, but she had never known how to stop the pieces from scattering. So she had kept walking. She thought if she just kept moving, she could outrun the hurt. But now, sitting on the horse, feeling the weight of the cowboy's steady presence, she felt a flicker of something different. Hope, maybe. Or perhaps it was just the relief of no longer being alone. She had spent so much time trying to carry everything by herself, but now, for the first time in days, she felt like she didn't have to do it all alone. The ride lasted a couple of hours, and as the shadows grew longer and the sun began to dip below the horizon, they reached the cowboy's ranch. The place was small but well-maintained, a modest collection of buildings that seemed to blend perfectly with the land. There were corrals where cattle grazed, a small barn, and a weathered house that looked as though it had been standing for decades. The air was cool now, and the evening breeze carried the scent of the desert, earthy, dry, and fresh all at once. The cowboy led the horse to a small paddock, where he tethered it to a post and then helped Jenna down from the saddle. She felt the ground beneath her feet, the soft dust of the earth settling against her tired legs. Her body still felt like it was made of lead, but at least now she was back in the company of others. She wasn't sure how to feel about that, but she was grateful for it nonetheless. "Come on inside," the cowboy said gently, motioning toward the house. "You can rest up. I've got food and water, and I'll get a bed ready for you." She wasn't used to this, having someone else take care of her. She had spent so many years doing everything on her own, and now, here she was, accepting help from a stranger. But there was something about the cowboy that made it easier to trust him. His calm demeanor, his quiet strength, it made her feel like she wasn't a burden, like she wasn't being pitied. Inside the house, the warmth of a fire greeted her. The simple, rustic furnishings, the old wooden table, the rough-hewn chairs, made the place feel lived in, welcoming in a way that Jenna hadn't experienced in a long time. She felt her shoulders relax as the weight of the day's travel started to lift. The cowboy moved to the kitchen, a small, cozy space that smelled of freshly cooked food. Jenna noticed the modest nature of the place. There were no frills, no excess. Everything had a purpose, and there was something comforting in that. "I've got some stew," he said, stirring a pot over the stove. "It's not fancy, but it'll fill you up." Her body craved nourishment, but her soul craved connection. She hadn't realized how much she had missed the company of another person until now. He ladled the stew into 2 bowls, and they sat down at the small wooden table. The fire crackled softly in the background, and for a moment, the world outside seemed far away. The sounds of the desert, the wind, the endless open spaces, they all faded into the background as they ate in silence. Jenna took a bite, the warmth of the stew spreading through her, grounding her, reminding her that she was still here, still fighting. The cowboy ate his meal without saying much, but he occasionally glanced at her, as if checking to see how she was doing. She could sense that he wasn't just being polite. He cared. He had stopped for a reason, after all. She wasn't sure what that reason was, but she knew it had to be more than just a simple act of kindness. After they finished eating, the cowboy cleared the table and moved toward the small fireplace. He stirred the embers, adding a log to keep the fire burning. "Get some rest," he said softly, looking over at her. "You can stay here as long as you need. I'll make sure you're taken care of." She had been running for so long, thinking that distance would give her the space she needed to heal. But perhaps what she really needed wasn't space. Maybe she needed people. Maybe she needed to let herself be seen, to stop hiding in the shadows of her own heart. She nodded, unable to say the words that were on her mind. There was too much to unpack, too much she wasn't ready to share. But the cowboy didn't push her for answers. He didn't ask about her past or pry into her story. He simply respected her silence, giving her the space she needed. Jenna made her way to the small guest room he had shown her earlier. It was simple, just a bed, a window looking out onto the desert, and a wooden chair in the corner, but it felt like a refuge. She hadn't realized how much she needed a place to rest until now. She sank into the bed, the soft sheets offering a comfort she hadn't experienced in so long. The sound of the wind outside, the distant rustle of trees, and the faint crackle of the fire in the other room were all she needed to drift into a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. As she closed her eyes, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, like a weight lifting from her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might finally be on the path to healing. The days that followed were marked by quiet routines. The cowboy, whose name Jenna learned was Luke, didn't rush her recovery. He let her take the time she needed to regain her strength, offering no pressure, only patience. The mornings were spent in silence. He worked the land, checking on cattle, fixing fences, and tending to the horses. Jenna would help when she could, though her strength was still returning and most of her days were spent resting. She helped where it made sense, feeding the horses, sweeping the porch, gathering firewood, but she never pushed herself too hard. Luke never expected more from her, and that simple fact made it easier for Jenna to relax. There was no urgency to her recovery, no push for her to open up or move faster than she was ready. Each day she felt a little stronger, and each night she slept a little better. The weight of the desert and her past seemed to drift away with each passing day, replaced by the peaceful sounds of the ranch, the low mooing of cattle, the whinnying of horses, the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. On the third morning, Jenna woke to the smell of fresh coffee wafting from the kitchen. The sun was still low in the sky, casting a soft, golden light through the window. She lay there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up, the distant sound of Luke working in the barn, the quiet chirp of birds outside. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to wake up in peace. The constant tension in her shoulders, the ever-present tightness in her chest, seemed to have loosened slightly since she arrived here. It wasn't just the physical recovery. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of life on the ranch that was slowly starting to heal something inside of her. As she sat up in bed, she saw the picture of water Luke had left for her on the small wooden table by the window. A few days ago, she would have felt uneasy at the gesture, unsure of how to accept such care. But now, she simply smiled to herself. She was learning to accept it, little by little. She took a drink from the pitcher and walked slowly into the kitchen. Luke was at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled warm and comforting. The kitchen was simple, with old wooden cabinets, a well-used table, and a window that looked out over the land. The warmth of the fire made the room feel inviting, and the smell of breakfast was enough to pull Jenna out of her thoughts. "Morning," she said softly, and Luke turned to greet her with a nod. "Morning. Sleep well." "Yeah, better than I have in a while. After breakfast, I'll show you the barn if you're feeling up to it." Jenna wasn't ready to spill her story, and neither was Luke. There was no pressure for words that weren't ready to be spoken. But sometimes silence was enough. It was a space where both of them could be without expectation. After breakfast, they headed outside, Luke leading the way toward the barn. The air was still cool from the morning and the land stretched out before them, the horizon wide and open. Jenna felt a familiar pull in her chest, the kind she used to feel when she first set out on her journey, like there was something just beyond the horizon waiting for her. But this time, the feeling wasn't one of escape. It was one of possibility. The barn was old but sturdy. Inside, there were several horses, each one calm and well-trained. Luke moved between them with ease, checking on them, feeding them and brushing them down. Jenna stood by the door, watching him work. She could see the quiet care he put into each movement, how he treated each horse with respect, like they were partners rather than animals. "Do you work with them often?" she asked, her voice soft, not wanting to interrupt the rhythm of his actions. "Most days," Luke replied, turning to her with a small smile. "I've always liked working with horses. They're honest, you know, no pretenses, just what you see." There was something straightforward about them, something pure in their simplicity. "You grew up around here?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Luke paused for a moment, his hands resting on the horse's neck. "Yeah," he said slowly, "born and raised. My family ran this ranch for years, passed it down to me. It's a good life, but it's not easy. There's always something that needs doing." "Must be nice," she murmured almost to herself, "having a place." The land had taken from her, too, her past, her sense of stability, her ability to trust. But here, with Luke, there was something different. She didn't feel like she was fighting against the world. She felt like she was simply being. They spent the rest of the morning in the barn, working together to tend to the animals. Jenna wasn't used to the physical labor, but it felt good to do something with her hands. The simple tasks, feeding the horses, sweeping the hay, checking the fence, helped clear her mind. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel weighed down by her past. She didn't feel like she was carrying a heavy burden. In the afternoon, after they had finished their work, Luke led her to a small spot near the creek that ran through the property. The water was clear and cool, flowing over smooth rocks in a gentle, rhythmic sound. The sun was high now, casting a warm, golden light over everything. They sat on a large rock looking out at the water. "You ever stop and think about where you're going?" Luke asked suddenly, his voice quiet. Jenna hesitated. She wasn't sure how to answer that. "Sometimes," she said, her gaze fixed on the water. "But it's hard to know when you don't even know where you started." The weight of not having answers. As the evening drew near, the sky began to turn shades of pink and purple, the stars slowly becoming visible in the clear night sky. Luke stood, brushing the dust off his pants. "You ready to head back?" he asked, his tone gentle. Jenna looked up at him, and for the first time she realized that she didn't need to keep running. She didn't need to keep escaping. There was something here, something worth holding on to. "Yeah," she said softly, standing up. "I'm ready." It was the fact that she no longer felt like she was alone. Luke had kept his distance in many ways, but his presence was never far. It was subtle, just the way he would check on her, ask if she needed anything, or help her with a task without making her feel like a burden. He never pushed her to open up about her past, and for that, Jenna was grateful. But there was a warmth in his silence, a quiet care that spoke louder than words. The connection between them had deepened over time, but it wasn't always in the form of conversation. Some days they would work side by side, the air thick with the scent of hay, the feel of the wind brushing against their faces, the ground beneath their feet solid and steady. Other days they would sit together by the creek, watching the water flow past, listening to the gentle murmur of nature. And in those moments there was no need for explanations. The unspoken bond between them was enough. Jenna had started to feel the weight of her old life lifting. The constant pressure of needing to escape, of needing to prove something to herself, was fading. The walls she had built around her heart slowly began to crumble, and though she wasn't ready to put all her past behind her, she could see a small crack of light shining through. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was running from something. She felt like she was standing still, finally at peace. But despite the calm, there were moments when the past would resurface. Memories she had long buried would creep in, reminding her of everything she had tried to leave behind. Late at night, when the world outside was quiet, Jenna would lie awake, her thoughts tumbling over each other like a storm. She hadn't shared much about her past with Luke, and there was a part of her that wasn't sure how to start. She wasn't sure she could. Luke, however, seemed to understand without needing to ask. He would notice when her eyes grew distant, when her movements became slower, when her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and he would simply give her space. He wouldn't press her for answers, wouldn't ask her to explain herself. It was the quiet respect of someone who knew that some wounds took time to heal, and who was willing to wait. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Jenna and Luke sat together on the porch. The air was warm, but a cool breeze had started to pick up, rustling the trees in the distance. The world felt peaceful still. They had been working together all afternoon, fixing the fence along the eastern side of the ranch, and Jenna had felt a deep sense of satisfaction as the last board was nailed into place. "Feels good to see things coming together," Luke said, breaking the silence. Jenna smiled, her hands resting in her lap. "Yeah, it does. It's strange, you know. I never thought I'd be here. I never thought I'd find a place where I could stop." Jenna looked out over the land, watching the shadows stretch across the dirt. For a long time she had been running from her past, from the pain, from the things she didn't know how to face. But now, with the ranch behind her, with the steady presence of Luke by her side, she felt something shift inside her. Maybe it wasn't about running anymore. Maybe it was about staying, about learning how to build something real. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the evening breeze. "I've spent so much of my life trying to get away from things. I thought if I could just keep moving, keep leaving things behind, I'd eventually get away from myself. But that's not how it works, is it?" "It's not. The past always has a way of catching up with us, whether we're ready for it or not. But the trick is to face it, to stop running and figure out who we are, even when it's hard." He understood that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy, complicated, and at times painful, but it was also possible. "I'm not sure I'm ready to face it all," she admitted, her voice low. "But for the first time, I don't feel like I have to do it alone." "You don't." The days began to turn into weeks, and the ranch became more than just a place to recover. It became a home that Jenna had never truly known, a home that had been waiting for her all along. Luke continued to teach her about the land, the animals, and the work that came with running a ranch. Jenna learned quickly, and her confidence grew with each new task. There were still difficult days when the past felt heavy and the weight of her old life would try to pull her back into the shadows. But she didn't let it control her anymore. She had a new purpose now, and it was one that belonged to her. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Luke turned to Jenna, his face more serious than usual. "I'm not sure what you're planning to do next, but I want you to know that you have a place here. If you decide to stay, I'll be here. If you decide to leave, I'll understand." The idea of staying, of building a life with Luke on this ranch, felt like a dream she hadn't allowed herself to believe in. She had never imagined she could find peace, let alone the possibility of a future. But here, with Luke, it felt like that future was possible. "I don't know what I'm ready for yet," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "But I do know this, being here with you, it feels right." And though she hadn't fully made peace with her past, she was no longer running from it. She was learning to face it, slowly, carefully, but with the knowledge that she didn't have to do it alone. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting the world in a soft, golden light, Jenna and Luke stood together on the porch, watching the horizon. It was a quiet moment, but it was full of meaning. "I think I'm ready," Jenna said, her voice soft but firm. "Ready to stay, ready to build something here with you." But there was something real between them now, something they had built together, brick by brick, over time. And as they stood there, hand in hand, watching the world stretch out before them, they both knew that this was just the beginning. The trail ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, they were both ready to walk it together.